you through all the biggest stories from the world of business, economy, and finance. Stories that impact you as a consumer. And we begin with a story that is only very familiar to you already. The story of wearables in India. What do I mean by wearables? Your smartwatches, your Fitbits, your Bluetooth wireless earphones. That's what the wearables market in India is all about, and it grew about 47% in the last year. And India shipped over 100 million units of wearables for the year 2022. And India is set to surpass even that and ship as much as 130 to 150 million units for the current year 2023, and lead the world as the largest exporter of wearables in the world. Bear in mind, wearables includes not only your smartwatches and your Fitbits and your health trackers, it also includes the TWS, or the totally wireless earphones or headphones that you use along with your mobile. And get this, India has already been shipping one wearable for every mobile phone that it has been exporting. So the wearable market in India is already exploding. Wearables made from India and exported to across the world. And India is set to get a market share of 26%. And currently, India is second only to China and the US, and it's all set to change. We have my colleagues Karthik Malhotra and Amit joining us in the studio this morning. Amit and Karthik, thank you so much. Karthik, I'm going to take this straight to Amit because Amit has been, doing all the research on this one. Amit, talk to us. Wearables are huge in India, and we've seen that explosion just before the pandemic. In fact, in 2019, India's wearables was doubling, in 2019 itself. Then came the pandemic, and then the importance of wearables probably, increased during the course of the pandemic, and it looks like now India's cashing in on the wearable opportunity.
Yeah, I think quite a bit of this has to do with the looming recession in the West, and affordability has become the big issue. So that is why the cost of basically purchasing average has gone down from $27 to around $22 to $25. And that is where India probably, which is making more affordable and feature-rich wearables, has basically taken advantage of this shift in the market. So I think you will have more to say.
And also, I'm guessing, Karthik, India is bleeding China when it is taking away so much of the wearable manufacturing business.
Not just that, Krishna. I mean, link this together with, let's say, what we've seen in mobile smartphone manufacturing in India.
Right.
A chunk of the manufacturing from China has moved to India already. And I'm not talking about small players here. You know the guys I'm talking about.
Yes.
I'm talking about Apple, I'm talking about Samsung, and I'm talking about a plethora of other companies which are actually following this China Plus One policy and shifting manufacturing to India. But I think the interesting part of the story here is not as much about manufacturing in India as it is about Indians also now finally adopting and sort of migrating to these new technologies. And I think this doubling that you spoke about in 2018, 2019 was of course on the back of a very low base. India was not an early adopter. I think back in 2018, you could just count maybe one or two companies which actually sold wearables in India, Goki being one of them. Of course,
Right.
Goki being the real initiator, innovator to introduce wearables to Indians. And then you had these low-cost Honor and Xiaomi devices which people bought, which are still in sync with the trend. Those were 2,000 rupees and under, or maybe nearabouts, right? So I think broadly speaking, what has really caught my attention is that for every smartphone sold in India, there is a wearable also sold. And that is, really saying something. Because that India is inundated with smartphones. Practically everybody has an internet connection, has a smartphone. But an equal number of people also having a wearable of some sort, smartwatch perhaps being one, or what I see you wearing constantly, the TWS, you said, totally wireless solutions, and these are earbuds. So I think wearables overall have found fancy in the Indian consumer, and this trend is likely to only continue from what I can see.
All right.
The good thing is just while India has a huge market of its own, we are penetrating the global markets. So
Yeah.
That is the good thing. 26% of the world is basically to put it metaphorically, wearing Indian wearables.
26% of the world, has, is wearing Indian wearables, wearable tech, so to speak. That's a great number. And Karthik, this is something you've been pointing out just now, which is about Indians themselves adopting more and more wireless technology and going forward. Now you have wireless, everything from speakers. Forget wearables. We're all going wireless, and the gadgetry levels are only increasing. We want an assistant. We want an Alexa to do the work for us. So it's incredible that India is sort of leading the way when it comes to wireless technologies and wearable technologies. And yes, my question here is that as India grows, the global consumption of wearables is also going to only grow.
I think, Krishna, just look at the population size, right? I think the debate starts and ends pretty much at the size of the population.
True.
And add to that, and there are other numbers, and I'm sure you're going to bring them up also in today's show. Look at the number of houses being sold.
Yes.
Look at the number of cars being sold. Look at the number of two-wheelers being sold. Look at the number of anything being sold, because India is a huge market. Now, China was obviously a much bigger market than India. But I think on tech adoption, India has been able to squarely beat China.
Right.
And overall, with supply chain constraints, not just exports from China, even imports into China or other geographies exporting to China, that volume would have reduced drastically. Now, India, of course, being the beneficiary of whatever is going on with the world versus China, is a great study. And the population, the sheer numbers, make India a great hub for doing business across the board. I'm sure, you put a finger on, let's say, the number of burgers sold in India, the number of pizzas sold in India, the number of office furniture sold in India. India is going to, by sheer volume of numbers, going to be a great market for practically any sort of technology, any sort of device.
What you told me just reminded me that there's a very good chance that there are more margarita pizzas being sold in India than in Italy.
Than in all of Europe, I would say. I would say in all of Europe.
Right. So there are two stories over here. One is the consume in India story, which is certainly supporting the wearable technology market. And second is the make in India story.
And sell to the world.
I sell to the world, which is also supporting the wearable market. And that's where, our second story for this morning, in fact, comes about. We're talking about wearable tech pieces from India being manufactured, mobile phones in India being manufactured. What do mobile phones have in common? All mobile phones, irrespective of any brand, or any feature or capacity, they all have something called as semiconductor chips. And guess which country makes the largest number of semiconductor chips in the world? Taiwan. And guess what is the percentage of semiconductor chips that Taiwan makes? 70%, ladies and gentlemen, 70 till date. Taiwan is the global semiconductor hub. Taiwanese companies are the guys who are pushing semiconductor technology forward, to the point where 90% of all advanced chips made in the world come from Taiwan. 70% of all semiconductor chips and 90% of all advanced chips come from Taiwan. And now it looks like Taiwanese companies are making a beeline to set up their manufacturing plant in India. And this is not just a rumor, but this is an inference from a statement made by a Taiwanese minister to the effect that, in emerging and critical technologies, Taiwanese companies want to set up their production base here in India. That's fantastic news, isn't it, Karthik and Amit? Amit, you'd like to go first?
Yeah, it is. It's part of the whole decoupling and China plus one move that is happening globally. So, and India is the biggest benefactor along with Vietnam and Indonesia. But this is part of that. But Taiwan is looking very big towards India is good news for India, because the people basically wooing the semiconductor chip market in a big way are Vietnam. And if we are getting it, so that is very, very good news coming from a minister from Taiwan.
Right. So in the sense that just because you have these problems going on in China and company ownership, manufacturing, it's not a straight road for India. You have so much competition from smaller nations who can offer a better price, differentiator at much lesser cost when it comes to manufacturing. So India has to be on its toes. But the fact of the matter is that a fair amount of traffic is coming our way, including all the traffic from Taiwan.
So look at it holistically, Krishna. Look at the political stability India has demonstrated.
Right.
I think for doing business in India, this was always a major concern. it's something which is referred to as nation risk, right, or country risk.
Correct.
India's country risk has reduced drastically, and this is the country risk is a function of political stability. It's a function of law and order. It's a function of number of terrorist attacks going down. So overall well-being of personnel, well-being of the plant that you've set up, and safeguarding, protecting that. Of course, the fourth one is ease of doing business, which India has been, some reports say India has been surging up, some reports say that no, India has been stagnant, and many say that no, India has not really broken any ground. But forget ease of business, doing business for now. The fifth, of course, is enforcement of contracts. These are constituents that add country risk and give a score to it. So so enforcement of contracts is still something that India needs to work on, given the fact that number of legal cases still pending hearing are huge, and we don't really still have completely digitized records of legal cases, etc. But keep all that aside, look at the enabling environment that India has begun to offer now. Number one, to begin with, the PLI scheme. 50%, let's say the investment of a certain unit is X. 1/2X is the only investment required by the investor, and the remaining half comes from the Indian PLI scheme. So why would a country or a factory or an industry not want to take advantage of that, given the fact that overall India's focus is shifting, if not another focal point is being added in the manufacturing realm instead of just focusing squarely on services.
Right.
So services, manufacturing and agriculture, of course, being the hot belt, we are now sort of completing our economic cycle when it comes to production, and manufacturing becomes a major sort of, flag bearer here. So PLI scheme, overall low country risk, political risk, access to a large labor market, and that labor market, of course, needs training, and there are labor reforms which are pending. But if you're able to skill that labor, and if you're able to pay that labor adequately, that labor is going to migrate to your factory than work anywhere else. So overall, the environment has become enabling. And add to that the number of cars we are making, the number of smartphones we are making. The same factory wanting to supply these semiconductors from Taiwan, ship them to India, versus make them in India and use the railway network or the road network. The economics are obviously going to work better for them. In any case, we have the likes of Foxconn and Pentagon and Winston already in India, making in India. Now add another, apparently one more factory has confirmed, one more industry has confirmed entry. Now which one that is, I don't know. But yeah, so I think the trend lines are fairly clear that political risk is low, country risk is low, economic stability is there, and overall there's an enabling environment. So it makes complete sense to take advantage of the labor available in India, the land available in India, and make in India.
Right.
Talking about land available, and 2 exclusive industrial parks have been promised to these Taiwanese semiconductor chip firms.
Right.
They'll be exclusive to only Taiwan companies. So that is how far India is basically going towards wooing the semiconductor market towards India, manufacturing towards India.
Right, fascinating, isn't it, Karthik? We have an industrial park. This sort of like takes us back to the SEZ era.
Exactly.
So you create a special economic zone. You want to call it SEZ, call it SEZ. You want to call it industrial park, call it industrial park. But the idea is to create that enabling environment that you're talking about, for companies to want to rush into India and start setting up business right away, because nobody wants to waste any time, because there is the semiconductor crisis has been dealt with, but I don't think we are ready to make the amount of semiconductors the future demand is for semiconductor chips. One more point I want to agree on, Karthik, you're talking about, is the manpower required. Even as India has ambitions to become this global semiconductor hub, another report states that the manpower requirement is going to go up 5 times in the next 2 years to staff all these semiconductor chip making companies. So that's something that's very important to note here as well.
Totally, employment.
Generating employment and making sure that we have the right skilled employment to offer all these companies, when they want to set up shop over here. That will be crucial, how India manages to meet the manpower needs. There is the infrastructure, logistical needs, and of course the push in the form of PLI policy that you're giving, but we will need that manpower push as well. Karthik, the one thing I want to ask is that this level, there needs to be government level coordination clearly between the Taiwanese government and the Indian government. And I want to understand how this will impact global geopolitics. If India is going to cozy up too much to Taiwan and Taiwanese companies and offering them all these special incentives, there are going to be like questions being raised, eyebrows being raised for sure.
But I think it is squarely in India's interest right now to cozy up to Taiwan, given the tension between Taiwan and China.
Right.
Taiwan is definitely not interested in doing business with China as China continues to do air sorties and what they call routine exercises around the borders and around the Taiwanese straits. So I think it is completely in India's interest now to ensure that this decoupling of China and Taiwan happens completely and Taiwan moves business to India versus China, and it is in Taiwan's economic interest as well. Tomorrow, in case there is a war-like situation between China and Taiwan, Taiwan's economy is not going to be dependent on China alone. It has a much stronger play when India has economic relations with Taiwan and wants to safeguard those economic relations in an adversity of, let's say, a war or any sort of aggression between China and Taiwan. Now, coming back to PLI, Krishna, PLI was one of the incentives open across multiple sectors, but there was also the government of India's push to invest 10,000 crore rupees into semiconductor manufacturing, and that project had not taken off up until now. So this 10,000 crore rupees waiting to be spent in the coffers of the government of India, waiting to be deployed into semiconductor manufacturing. Now that takes off, hopefully, with Chinese investments coming into India through setting up of semiconductor plants, and look at the multiplier that is going to have on, let's say, the auto industry, on the electronics industry, on the smartphone manufacturing industry, and not just in adding efficiency, but also reducing prices for India, because the entire logistics cost of importing these semiconductors, paying duty on them, and the logistics of supply chain getting them from Taiwan to India pretty much come to an end. And now add to that one more element of the GST you collect by way of this manufacturing happening in India. So overall, look at the multiplier. So I think any investment coming into India is absolutely welcome, and something which is critical to India's manufacturing prowess, being semiconductors, coming into India is obviously great. So Micron had set that ball rolling when PM Modi was in the US. Allied Materials had seconded that. Hopefully Tesla will also make an entry at some point, but until then, I think these Taiwanese companies coming into India is great.
Can't wait for Tesla to come to India, but as you're rightly pointing out, in terms of economic impact, the fact that India's ambitions to become a global semiconductor manufacturing hub is taking off is very, very important because of the multiplier effect that you are talking about. I also want to just put things in perspective. The fact of the matter is that ever since the trade ties went sour between Beijing and Washington, between the US and China, you have Taiwan saying the fact that they are looking to diversify and reduce their dependence on China, Karthik, and that's also very important. Taiwan itself wants to reduce its over-dependence on China, and it's been looking to shift its production bases to across the world, to anywhere from Europe to North America to Southeast Asia and India as well. And clearly, because of India's policy making, Taiwan is finding it easier to choose India as an option. Taiwanese companies are finding it easier to use China as an option, and strategically speaking, not just for India, for Taiwan too, having a portion of its economic fortunes, based out of India, strategically is very important as well for Taiwan per se, and that's the reason why you're seeing, Taiwanese companies, pushed by their own government, are coming to India. All roads lead to India as far as Taiwanese chip makers are concerned, and here's hoping that more and more Make in India continues to happen here in India. And on those hopes, Karthik, guess who else is all set to want to start making in India?
I saw the rundown, so I'm not going to venture a guess. Go ahead and tell them.
I'm sure all of you have already read it in the newspapers or in the social media, and we're talking about Boeing, ladies and gentlemen. The American aircraft maker Boeing is all set to set up an assembly line here in India. One of the world's biggest aircraft manufacturers is looking to set up a production line in India. So we're going from anything from a small chip to a huge aircraft being made in India, and global companies which make this for the entire world wanting to move to India to make it out of India. Karthik, chips are one thing, advanced chips are another thing. Aircraft are another ball game altogether. Aircraft assembly line in India, and that too Boeing, no less.
Huge, absolutely huge, as big as the aircraft, if not bigger than that, right? So Absolutely. I think, there's no doubt that, again, like everybody else, Boeing is also seeing great potential in the amount of orders that India is booking with Boeing and with Airbus. I'm surprised actually that Airbus was not the first one to announce it. It's Boeing. But I have no doubt that sooner than later, Airbus is also going to want to shift assembly to India. And simply because look at the number of aircraft Indian airlines have sort of booked with both these, and it's a duopoly, right? I think it's a pure duopoly between Boeing and Airbus. There isn't a third as big, as large an aircraft maker. Of course, you have the likes of Embraer, and you have the likes of Cessna, and you have some of these other smaller companies, but nobody produces commercial aircraft at scale the way Boeing and Airbus do. Up until now, the rumors were, or the sort of aspirations were, that both Boeing and Airbus are going to further intensify their MRO setups in India, which is your maintenance, repairs, operations, etc. Right? So you were hoping that MRO would come to India. So every time there's a faulty engine, or every time there's a faulty part within the overall aircraft, it does not have to be grounded indefinitely. You don't have to wait for parts to come from some other corner of the world, and you don't really have to ground tons of your fleet until repair work happens. But so of course, so MRO was basically the aspiration, but here we're talking about complete assembly lines, which again make immense sense, because hopefully with the kind of traffic at airports India is seeing, with the number of flyers taking to the skies, with the kind of aircraft order that the likes of Indigo or Air India or other smaller companies are now placing with these global aviation manufacturers, I think it is only obvious that Airbus is going to be next.
Right, and you're talking about MRO is maintenance related, whereas what you're talking about here is FAL, or final assembly line.
That's right.
Now you have the India head of Boeing say that the final assembly line is doesn't have as much value, say, as in smartphones or wearables or one of those things. So it's about 10% of value addition for an aircraft happens in the final assembly line, and as the demand for aircraft from Indian carriers grows up, you have Boeing looking to set up that final assembly line in India so that the deliveries can take place faster than usual. But it's a good time to remind everybody that in the recently concluded Paris Air Show, you had Boeing plus Airbus receiving orders from India worth $120 billion. That's the size of demand. As a kind of business, we're giving $120 billion worth of aircraft ordered by Indian carriers. You have Indigo, you have Air India, both of them. Massive orders to both Boeing and Airbus, the duopoly that we're talking about, $120 billion. And before this, as far as aerospace is concerned, India was exporting components worth about $1 billion before that. And I think, from Boeing's perspective, you hear that India head Salil Gupte talk, and he's talking about the fact that final assembly line is one end of the things, but idea is to make engines from India. Absolutely. And that's where the real game is when it comes to making in India, aircraft making in India, isn't it, Karthik?
Totally. But I think that is still a long way ahead, and it's a steep climb up. And look at what India, let's say HAL, did with the Tejas or the LCA, light combat aircraft engines, been in production manufacturing some stage since the 1980s. And until now, we don't have a reliable engine. And that is what led to the deal between Rolls-Royce and, General Atlantic and General Electric's, GE, and India to have this transfer of technology up to 80%. Some reports suggest that 80% of the technology will be transferred to India for HAL to be able to manufacture those jet engines in-house. Now, you are hoping and looking for such deals to happen with large commercial aircraft engine manufacturers like, let's say, Rolls-Royce or GE, or even Pratt & Whitney for that matter. So you're looking at large TOT, transfer of technology memorandums to be signed as opposed to pure assembly. But I think let's take everything as it comes. MRO, great news. Final assembly line, definitely good news. If nothing else, at least you're engaging a large chunk of Indians into an employed sector, into an organized employment sector. And of course, add to that the speed of delivery, the logistics of transportation, etc. All of that get eased. And now if you have assembly happening in India, I think any large manufacturer worth his or her salt is going to want to ensure that the suppliers are close by. You don't want to be in a situation that you're importing every single component from 20 different places in the world and only assembling in India. You need access to raw material, you need access to finished products, you need access to labor markets, you need access to land, and of course you need access to the final delivery, your buyer. So as long as you know that the buyer is here in India, the assembly through labor is happening in India, through land is happening in India, I think the only two components left now are going to be access to raw material and access to finished components that can be brought into the assembly line.
Right. Adding to what Karthik has been talking about, fact of the matter is that Boeing already announced a $100 million investment in India when Prime Minister Modi was in the US, and clarifying as to where that $100 million is going to go through. Here is the argument from Boeing. Boeing says that, global, as far as the world is concerned, India, it sourced worth $1 billion from India, even during the pandemic when sourcing was dropping from everywhere in the world because there were no aircraft flying over there. And somehow the sourcing from India for Boeing, largely 2/3 of it was manufacturing. So India already is one of the best original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, as far as the aerospace business is concerned. And so that has remained stable, and that indicates the kind of demand that India has. Even during the pandemic, if Boeing is sourcing $1 billion worth of of components from here, that includes 2/3 of manufacturing, that says a lot about India. That's one thing. Add to that this $100 million investment that Boeing is making in India. Boeing is again talking about the demand growth in India, which means that you'll need that many more pilots, that many more ground staff, that many more everything support staff to get Indian aviation where it needs to. And Boeing is saying that it's going to invest this $100 million in simulators and pilot training and getting the ecosystem ready when the aircrafts are done getting assembled over here. So in that sense, a very holistic effort that Boeing is making towards as far as India is concerned.
Totally. And as far as India's total order book goes, the demand India has for aircraft within this decade, before 2030 kicks in, we are looking at an order book of 1,300 aircraft already. India is going to have 1,300 new aircraft. Now, some of these numbers are clear because Indigo had placed an order for 500 aircraft with Airbus, not Boeing. Air India, prior to that, had placed an order of 470 aircraft, split between Boeing and Airbus. So this is already a 970 order book that we know of. And look at SpiceJet, look at
halfway through the year.
Yeah, we are halfway through this year. And of course, I mean, none of these deliveries are going to happen overnight. Even with the assembly line coming up in India, it's not that within a year or so these aircraft will start flying out of those assembly lines, ready to take off. But overall, that's the kind of order book that these aviation biggies already have from India, and this is only going to grow. So it's only obvious that you have assembly here in India. Now, the fact that some component sourcing was happening from India, small component of the overall amount of components that go into an aircraft. But again, I think China's zero COVID policy helped us immensely. Why else would, during the thick of the pandemic, would they look at India for importing? Only because they had faced a supply chain constraint because Chinese factories were shut.
Yes.
India decided to open up much quicker. China, until mid last year, was completely shut. So we have been able to milk that opportunity well.
So milking the opportunity is one thing, and of course the demand growth, the growing Indian middle class, which can afford flight tickets, which wasn't the case, Karthik, when civil aviation took off about 20 years ago. Remember the first flights we took 20 years ago, and look at what's happening right now, and look at our own expectations from flights. Once upon a time, we were happy as we got a ticket, because in the 80s, to get a flight ticket, you need to be well connected or you knew somebody at Air India. But by the time 2000s rolled around, we all could get tickets and take flights, but they were very expensive. Now we're back to come a full circle with more expensive flights all over again.
And I'm just wondering, Krishna, how many of those airlines are in existence today? You're talking about early 2000s, you had Air Sahara.
Karthik, the airlines of 5 years ago are not there.
Yeah, exactly. You had Jet Airways, you had Air Sahara, you had Indian Airlines.
My first flight was in Air Sahara.
Right, you had Indian Airlines, which pretty much became Air India and no more, government owned. And then you had the first low-cost carrier called Air Deccan.
Yes.
Look at the fate of all of these. None of them are there. So that's how dynamic the
Air
Indian
Deccan,
aviation market has
right,
been.
Air Deccan merged with Kingfisher, and then Kingfisher got shut down. So it's crazy. But the fact of the matter is that the opportunity is huge, and the fact that a company like Boeing is seeing that opportunity, both in terms of demand for aircraft in India and the market in India, and India's ability to make aircraft components and in fact eventually the aircraft assembly itself. So
now the beauty is, Krishna, that this assembly line is not going to cater to India alone. It's going to cater to the whole region.
Yeah, make it India for the world.
Yeah, and they will not have, let's say, Boeing or Airbus will not see the kind of potential in, let's say, a country like Sri Lanka. Not just today, even Sri Lanka 10 years from now, once it recovers from the economic turmoil it sees itself in right now. Even when Sri Lanka emerges from that, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years from now, it's not going to still be, generating the kind of demand that India is generating. Look at Bangladesh. Look at Nepal. Look at our smaller neighbors. They are all going to have their economies growing and they will have more need for civil aviation to take off, for passengers to take to skies. Not just domestically within their countries, but even international sectors. And it makes immense sense for Boeing or Airbus. And I insist on Airbus again because I think Airbus is seeing as much, if not more, number of orders from Indian flyers.
Correct.
And Indian aviation companies. Yeah. So I think it makes complete sense for them to have a strong foothold in the South Asian region, given the kind of growth which is expected to happen in the Asian markets, as opposed to our counterparts in the West, which have pretty much stagnated. And not just economically, but even demographically. So the kind of business that will get done in Asia, in South Asia, is going to far exceed the kind of business being done in Europe and US.
And that will be primarily driven by the domestic aviation markets of all these countries, especially India, because the number of people taking domestic flights will be a huge multiple of the number of people taking international flights, and more connectivity in India happens through flights and lesser dependency on the railways hopefully going forward. A huge development. Bear in mind, it's going to take a while before this final assembly line of Boeing comes to India. But what it really tells you is the sentiment of companies like Boeing and the sentiment that companies like Boeing are picking up from India and the Indian industry. So it's like in Hindi they say "Tali dono haath se bajti hai," and in this case clearly tali baj rahi hai, and in the skies loudly. Here's hoping that our flight ticket rates come down eventually. That's all that I'm interested in at the end of the day. More aircraft, more airline carriers in India. Let carriers come and go. Let's have more people coming in than going. So you average it over a period of time, and our tickets become saner at the end of the day.
But that's where the challenge is, Krishna. If there is price competition between ticket prices, then the loss-making airlines will continue to make even more losses.
True.
Because it takes forever for break-even to be achieved by aviation companies. And you need to have really, really deep pockets to be able to sustain this deep discounting on tickets. If you were to look at the break-even for every flight ticket sold in India, you will not be able to sustain even the high air ticket prices that you have right now. When you amortize the cost of the aircraft, you amortize the parking space across multiple airports, the salaries of the crew, of course, the whole aviation fuel and the logistics of
ATF prices have sort of stabilized in the recent past thanks to crude oil prices stabilizing in the recent past.
Yeah, but they've stabilized on dollar value. INR has not stabilized against USD. So, I mean, we look at dollar prices and we say, hey, oil prices have stabilized, but Indian rupee is still depreciating. So it doesn't really add anything for us. So the point is that with deep discounting, or even if not deep discounting, if just simple price competition between aviation companies, the fact that you have a large ticket Tata group already in the aviation sector, flying at least 3 carriers when you look at Air Vistara, Air India, Air Asia, right? And of course, the tie-up with Singapore Airlines, if you look at that entity alone and then you look at India's largest domestic carrier, Indigo, there is a duopoly in India as well in the aviation sector. Now, for any other third player, fourth player to want to eat into a large share of the market, the kind of cash burn they will have to do is going to be so enormous that it's going to bleed them out. So the only option left then would be some sort of consolidation. So you either go back into the Tata, Air India, Air Vistara combine, or let's say an Indigo starts buying these ailing, and there were rumors that Indigo would possibly look at buying Go First, which it did not. But then you will eventually have a situation that the deep-pocketed guys are going to control the pricing, and that price cartelization is going to happen.
Right. Another point I'd like to make at this stage is, Karthik, they say that the Indian aviation industry is really not, meeting its potential until the time Indian companies are able to take out flights for the entire world. International flights and the growth in international flights from India, and India being used as a sort of entrepot hub for people, like an Abu Dhabi or a Dubai or a Hong Kong. That's when, because look at the way we're developing airports across the country. So clearly, we're moving in that direction where India also becomes a transit hub, like an Abu Dhabi or a Dubai or a Hong Kong.
Totally.
And then you have more and more, flights going outside of India, from India, by Indian carriers. And I think, that eventually will sort of take care of the pangs of, high cost as far as domestic aviation is concerned, where price, is that much more difficult to arrive at and to be profitable. So here is hoping that Boeing, helps us manufacture a lot of aircraft going forward. A lot of that aircraft are used by Indian air carriers to fly to the US, where Boeing is from, or to Europe, or across the world, and the Indian aviation industry finally, reaches its potential at the earliest, and we're fingers crossed for that. But moving on and away from space, back down to Earth, some good news here on Earth as well. Because, while we're talking about these huge aircraft orders and Indians wanting to fly all the time, before Indians fly, Indians are riding on the road all the time. So, Karthik, we're talking about passenger car sales improving, stabilizing. It's great news. And you're looking at the month of June, nearly 2% rise in passenger vehicle sales. And all of that being driven by India's favorite passenger vehicle for the last 3 years, the SUV.
Great. I think, we've discussed this multiple times, Krishna, and I think any of our viewers wanting to scrub back to any old episodes will see that this is one subject we really hold close, dear to our hearts.
Because we use an SUV to get to the studio.
And, and vested interest because you, for whatever reason, are yet to buy and ride on this growth story. And I think it's about
too many options.
It's about time. Narrow it down. Look at what Maruti is offering you. Right.
Talk to us about what Maruti is doing.
4 SUVs launched in the last 1 year, laughing their way, driving their way, laughing to the bank accounts of Maruti Suzuki. Look at Jimny, launched last month, Fronx, Grand Vitara, an expensive car, hybrid and all, and the Brezza. For a company that thrived primarily on hatchbacks, entry-level cars, Maruti 800, Maruti Alto, right? These were cars that you saw inundated on Indian roads. They were crowding up narrow Indian streets, right? And I'm not just talking about our growing up years, Krishna. You and I are almost the same age, right? And I'm not just talking about what was on Indian roads 30 years ago.
What?
I'm talking about as recently as maybe 10 years, 12 years, 15 years ago, right? Where hatchback was the obvious option, and only those who could afford it went in for a sedan. And again, the sedan segment, mind you, was primarily the Maruti S-Team to begin with.
It was called Maruti 1000 before.
Maruti 1000, that was the 1000cc engine. The 1300cc engine became the Maruti S-Team. You had the S-Team, you had the Hyundai Verna, you had the Honda City. And what else did you have? Did you have anything else? I don't know. I don't remember.
The latest being
maybe
Maruti
the Ford Icon, etc. Right? And the Ciaz 10 years ago. So that's all you had. Nobody in India really thought of SUVs as something they could own. And look at where we are today. 46% of the new car sales happening in India are SUVs. 46%, that's almost every second car sold in India in the last 6 months, I'm talking about this calendar year, has been an SUV. They were called the fuel guzzlers. This was the Americanization of roads, where they said that, America has been importing oil by negotiating long-term contracts with oil producers because Americans only drive SUVs, which are guzzlers. They don't care about their fuel bill because they have long-term contracts. And look at India. You have a situation where diesel cars are pretty much end of life after 10 years. You don't have an uptake for diesel cars anymore because consumers don't see value. We're talking about petrol cars and we're talking about SUVs. Hatchbacks on the other side, which were dominating Indian roads, have been reduced to what I think a 33%, one-third. So 1 in every 2 cars sold is an SUV, but 1 in every 3 cars sold is a hatchback. And that speaks volumes about India's aspirations. Now, this demand is pretty much in equal measure from rural India and urban India. The growth in rural India, in fact, has been a little higher than urban India at 14%. rural Indian car sales have grown 14% versus 11% for urban India. So the drive, the growth in driving India's automobile industry is emanating in greater measure from rural India than urban India.
That's extremely heartwarming news, because that's the questions asked every single time any of these data comes out to show the strength of the Indian economy. The question that's always asked is, what is happening with the rural economy? Is that on the revival path? And the fact that the rural demand for passenger vehicles is a very telling sign that rural demand is certainly on its revival path, and in fact, its revival is faster than the urban. Urban markets, and in that sense, it's great news. I was just checking up about the percentages of cars being sold, Karthik. You were absolutely spot on saying that, like, the biggest chunk of cars sold in India, 43%, are SUVs, and what they've managed to do is that push hatchbacks, the classic Indian favorite, down to the second spot. Even now, Indians, 32% of them, buy hatchbacks. So, let's talk. I mean, what has really happened is actually, as Karthik was talking about, something that's earth moving. We've been hatchback people for 2 decades now. And suddenly, in this new decade, in the 2020s, if I may.
4 decades, actually, Krishna. we are pretty old now. 1980s, I think 86 is when Maruti 800 drove into India.
3 decades, because I would count from Hyundai Santro onwards.
Okay, sure.
The Santro was in the 90s.
About 23, 24 years.
Yeah, so about 3 decades is what I'm talking about. Santro, in fact, Santro sort of was the first official hatchback, because they came up with the hatchback as compared to the Maruti 800, which wasn't a hatchback, so to speak. And then Maruti sort of competed that with Maruti Swift, and you got the entire hatchback revolution happening 25 years ago, and that is gone, and an SUV revolution is happening. And an interesting point to bring out, Karthik, all those who are looking to buy SUVs, these are fuel guzzlers. This is what they were traditionally called. For us looking at Americans who don't have any manpower in their gasoline stations, and people just go and just take one of those things and shove it into their cars and fill it up the way they want to, and then drive as much as they want to, consume as much as they want to. In that economy, that's where SUVs were born. The sports utility vehicle. I mean, usually you have a sports vehicle, you go race with it, or you have a utility vehicle, and the racing vehicles guzzle a lot of fuel. And for some weird reason, for the sake of tashan or style, Americans came up with SUVs, which is fuel-guzzling, stylish-looking cars meant for consumers on regular roads and not on racetracks. So somehow, like we've adopted everything from burgers to pizzas, we seem to have adopted the SUV revolution as well, where customer comes first. The customer wants a sturdy car, and in that sense, the SUVs does offer Indians that sturdy car that they're looking for, which they can drive outside of the city over the weekends, because so many Indians leave their small towns to come to big cities to work. They need their SUVs to drive back to their hometowns and come back to the big city.
I don't know, data might prove me to be incorrect on this, but my feeling is, I think it is purely aspirational. It has nothing to do with the utility, with the quality, with
I was
anything
trying
else.
to see this utility.
I mean, obviously, these cars, because they are more expensive, they are a little more plush on the interiors, they're a little more rugged on the outside. But I think it is pure play aspiration which is driving SUVs.
So it's
I don't think it's utility. The sports utility vehicles, I don't think
it's not about the utility. It's about the sports of it all.
It's about style. It's about something that you associate with. You want to be seen driving. It is something that means, your vehicle means something to you, and it pretty much reflects your personality. I think that is what, it's pretty much like the mobile phones.
I was just about to say, that's the reason why you should never ask questions to people who are buying Apple iPhones, because they clearly know it's not about value for money, but it's about the aspiration that they have in their hearts, and how well an Apple phone can satisfy, just like how an SUV satisfied your aspirations for having a passenger vehicle. And with that, we move on to the last story this morning, Karthik. It's a very important story where we've been discussing so many other things, and this morning the markets have opened. Karthik, before we talk about the markets this morning, now we are coming beginning this week after a week of record highs last week. Ladies and gentlemen, bear in mind, last week Sensex scaled a fresh peak of 64,000 and the Nifty hit a fresh peak of 19,000. And all through last week, as Indian markets were hitting those fresh peaks, we're talking about how FPIs, or foreign portfolio investors, international, portfolio companies that invest in the Indian stock markets, they've been extremely bullish on India, and that trend seems to be continuing for the month of June as well when compared to the month of June last year. Karthik, talk to us in terms of both the FPI interest levels in India and about the levels that Indian markets are hitting this morning.
Right. So if we were to look at BSE Sensex right now, it's up about 415 points, so 0.64%, at about 65,133, 138 right now. Look at Nifty. Nifty is also higher by about 300 points from the 19,000 peak it did last week, trading 117 points up at 19,306.
So the momentum continuing.
Momentum continues.
Yes.
No doubt. We are already about an hour, 15 minutes since the markets opened, and the momentum has sustained. Right. Why are FPOs really looking at India? FPOs, of course, are the quickest to exit when they sense any signs of trouble, and they take all market momentum with them as they exit. But this bull run is also, an attraction point for FPIs, simply because look at Indian markets as compared to the global counterparts, and look at India's overall interest rate cycle that has paused for the last 2 months. So there is hope that now, with this pausing, the hawkish pause of the RBI, interest rates are finally stable, inflation is under control. There is going to be consumption, and if there is consumption, there is going to be greater offtake of credit by corporate India, which will be deployed back in growth. And if that growth happens, corporate India's numbers shore up, market performance of those companies obviously gets better. So I think overall, as compared to rest of the world, where when FPIs had exited India and had invested in US Fed, the treasury market in the US, I think at that time it was fairly obvious that they were looking at stability, they were looking at assured returns, and the risk appetite had gone down. I think with Indian markets reaching record highs, with the pause that RBI has now initiated in rate hike cycles, which has not been the case with US or other emerged markets and the developed markets, I think greater interest back in India to unleash a little more risk, plow money back into the Indian markets and take those returns.
But as from a retail investor's perspective, from an individual investor like me or just anybody else out there, how these markets, some analysts say, are overheated, which means the prices are too high of a stock. They're overheated, as they are called, which means that if somebody were to go out to buy a stock today because, hey, the markets are doing so well, I should buy a stock, I should buy some stocks and keep it. The stocks are overpriced is what they say.
Totally.
And some analysts even go to the extent of saying that all this is fine, but expect a correction in the months ahead.
So I'm not a financial advisor, right? So
neither of us are. We're just listening to people.
Whatever we say is based on what we've read and the experts we have spoken to.
Yes.
In fact, just last week we were speaking to Amit Gupta and a few other experts, and I think the advice coming out is fairly clear that perhaps mutual fund investments done through SIPs rather than lump sum payments would be an advised route right now for investors. With the assumption that markets are overheated, you enter right now with a lump sum, and if there is some sort of a correction in the markets, in the prices of the stocks you've bought directly or through your mutual funds, could go down. It could be a while before they recover. But I think everybody is bullish on India's long-term prospects, and I think the message coming out is that sell India at your own risk. So I don't think there is any advantage right now in profit booking, because nobody knows whether we have already reached the saturation point of overheating,
or there is still
a long way to go. The trend line suggests that markets are going to shine a little more for the next couple of days, but you never know how markets eventually fare.
So talk to your investment advisors before you take a decision. Don't go just by news headlines. But yes, the headlines, the fact of the matter is that those investing in Indian stocks from across the world, they're extremely bullish on India. We're talking about the FPIs, or the foreign portfolio investors. But foreign portfolio investors have this tendency to enter very quickly and exit very quickly, as well as Karthik was talking about. So watch out so you don't make your decisions solely on basis of what FPIs, or foreign portfolio investors, are doing in the Indian stock market. And with that, I'm afraid we've completely run out of time here on this edition of Business Plus this Monday morning. Thank you, Karthik, for joining us and helping us put all those big stories from the world world of business, economy, and finance into perspective. So you can continue watching more. We'll be back with Business Plus at 4 p.m. this evening as well, with how the markets closed for the day and all the other big stories that we are tracking here. Thank you so much for watching, for tuning in this morning into this broadcast. This is KrishnaKumar signing off. Keep it with News9.
Europe's deadliest war since 1945.
बाहर सायरन्स बजने लग गए थे.
Citizens homeless in their own country.
वो लिटरली हमको धक्का मार के बाहर फेंक रहे थे कि तुम लोग अलाउड नहीं हो.
22,500 Indian students in the line of fire.
डर हर सेकंड बना रहता था. नॉर्मली एक इंसान अगर उठता है तो अलार्म से उठता है. हमारा अलार्म तो था ही बॉम्ब.
India steps in with an air bridge.
After the military operations began on the 24th of February, there was a crisis management summit level group personally headed by the Prime Minister, and within a day of the military operation starting, the first of the evacuation flights had actually already started.
No Indian left behind.
बहुत गर्व हुआ मैं भारत में अपने. वो भी चाह के पाकिस्तान के जो बच्चे के वो कह रहे कि काश हमारा प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी होता.
वेलकम बैक टू द मदरलैंड.
Watch Airlift, the inside story of Operation Ganga on News9 Plus for the Genflix.
Pakistan is actually genociding Baloch people. So being Baloch is a crime. If you are a Baloch, it means in the eyes of Pakistan, you don't have any right to live.
The Chinese and Pakistanis are colonizing the Baloch and exploiting their resources.